Okay, we're going to be reviewing The Ethics of Belief, both W.K. Clifford's Evidentialism, and then we'll turn to William James's Pragmatism. So the ethics of belief, as a topic, the question is, can our beliefs be morally right or wrong? We know our beliefs can be true or false, and we also have a sense that they can be more or less reasonable, more or less, say, justified by the amount of evidence that supports them, maybe, or more or less rational. But the question of the ethics of belief is, first, can beliefs be evaluated morally in the same way that actions can be morally right or wrong, which goes beyond just mere truth or falsity, rationality or irrationality? Can they have this moral quality of rightness or wrongness? Can it be wrong to believe something? And then if so, when and why is a belief moral or immoral? Or put another way, when and why is it immoral for me to believe something? And when is it immoral for me to believe something? Which beliefs and on what grounds are right and which ones are wrong? One of the most famous answers to this question comes from W.K. Clifford, and his answer is given in a piece entitled The Ethics of Belief. In many ways, Clifford was one of the first to explicitly, I think, identify beliefs as a potential object of moral inquiry and moral evaluation. And Clifford's famous rule, or his answer to the question of can beliefs be moral or immoral and when, is one, yes, he thinks it can be immoral or wrong to believe something, and two, specifically, the beliefs that are wrong are those that are based on insufficient evidence. So here is Clifford's rule. This statement of Clifford's rule actually comes toward the end of the piece, or at least the portion of the piece that we read. But it's clearly his main thesis and his theory of the ethics of belief. So Clifford's rule, or CR, says, it is always wrong everywhere for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. It's a universal and exceptionless proposed principle of the morality or ethics of belief. Clifford's argument is relatively simple. He uses this idea of a beliefs having significance, that certain beliefs are significant. And specifically, the sense of significance he has in mind is social significance. He doesn't use the phrase social significance, although he does use the phrase significance. I'm going to just use the expression social significance to capture what he's talking about. And we can say a belief is socially significant when it is capable of affecting the welfare of others. So when the holding of a given belief has at least the potentiality or the capacity to affect the well-being of people other than the believer, then we'll call that belief socially significant. Clifford's argument for CR, or for the claim that it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence, turns on this idea of social significance of beliefs. Here's the first premise of that argument. It is always wrong for anyone to believe anything that is socially significant upon insufficient evidence. If you, in other words, have a belief that has the capacity to affect the welfare of others, either positively or negatively, then it's immoral for you to not seek out and have sufficient evidence for that belief before you hold it, right? That's the thought. He's like, look, at the very least, evidence is the moral measure of belief in cases where the belief can impact the well-being of others. I mean, this makes sense just in the abstract, partly because morality, you might think morality arises and moral evaluation arises precisely in those domains when our actions and our sort of doings, whether mental or physical, can affect someone other than ourselves. That's suddenly when moral evaluation is relevant. How am I affecting others? It's not just about me. The second premise is this: every belief is socially significant. So combining those two, you can see how Clifford's rule follows, or the way we've put it in the past. Clifford's rule validly follows from premise 1, CR1, and premise 2, CR2. If it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything that is socially significant upon insufficient evidence, and if it's also true that every single belief is socially significant, it follows that it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything at all upon insufficient evidence. That's just another way of saying that Clifford's rule is true. Clifford does give defenses of both of these premises. We're not going to set them up as sort of formal numbered premise defenses, but in the first case, in the case of the first premise, he instead of giving us a sort of numbered premise defense, he appeals to some thought experiments that are not actually that not that sci-fi or not that far from things that almost certainly have actually happened. Okay, so why think that it's always wrong for anyone to form any socially significant belief on insufficient evidence? His defense of this claim appeals to the shipowner case, right? Key narrative details here. I'm not going to walk through the whole case, but the key narrative details. The shipowner believes that his ship is seaworthy, despite the fact that the shipowner has not done his due diligence to make sure that his ship is in fact seaworthy. And indeed, the ship owner has some evidence to the contrary, that this ship is getting a little old and in fact may not be seaworthy. Now, it's not completely falling apart. He doesn't have a ton of evidence that it won't make it if he lets it set sail. But his evidence, rather, is merely insufficient to establish one way or the other. Nevertheless, because of the monetary incentives, because of his hope that he isn't doing something dangerous, he casts aside those doubts he has and forms the belief, no, it'll be fine, this ship is seaworthy. And he puts a bunch of people on the ship and sends it off, and sure enough, the ship was not seaworthy. Even though he believed it was, the ship sinks and people die. That's the first version. Version 2 is exactly the same as version 1, except this. Clifford says, let us alter the case a little and suppose the ship was not unsound after all, and that she made her voyage safely. So case 2 is just like case 1, but the way I set it up in class, we imagine that through just a stroke of sheer luck, in version 2, the ship happens to make it across. It's not as though in version 2, the ship owner had any more evidence that the ship was seaworthy than he did in version 1. It's just that in version 2, he and the people aboard the ship got lucky. No one gets hurt in version 2, but it's a close call. Clifford asks us to reflect on these two cases. And then he says, what shall we say of him, that is the ship owner? What is our moral judgment of this man? Surely this, that he was verily guilty of the death of those men. Now, we don't have to necessarily go so far as Clifford does to say that the guy is essentially a murderer. To agree with him that it's plausible that the ship owner did something gravely immoral. And in particular, Clifford wants you to focus on the belief. It was wrong of him to believe that the ship is seaworthy. Now, why? Like, what is the source of the immorality here? Because, it might not necessarily have anything to do with evidence. The first thing to note is that this is clearly a socially significant belief. Somebody who's in this role of being a ship owner and whose judgments about the seaworthiness of his own ship are the beginning and end of whether the ship set sail with people on it. That belief has the potential to affect the welfare of others. And indeed, in the first case, people lost their lives. But it had that potential even in the second case, right? Just because nobody happened to die doesn't mean that that belief didn't have the potential to affect people's well-being. And indeed, notice that social significance wasn't defined in terms of the negative potential effects on others, but merely any effects whatsoever on the well-being of others, people other than the believer. So what made it immoral? And Clifford eliminates a few possibilities, right? So we've got this socially significant belief that we all agree that was really irresponsible for the ship owner to believe what he believed. Well, why? What is it about this belief that, in addition to its social significance, made it immoral? Because not every socially significant belief is immoral. Well, it's not the fact that the ship owner was insincere in holding the belief, because Clifford makes very clear that the ship owner was completely convinced by the time he forms his belief that the ship was going to make it across. It's not like he cynically thought, oh, I know it's not going to make it, but I'll say publicly that it will. No, he really believed it would. Nor is it that the ship owner had a false belief. That is, it's not immoral. The reason that the ship owner's belief was immoral isn't because he falsely believed that the ship would make it across. Why? Well, because think about in version 1, yes, the ship owner's belief was false, but in version 2, it was true, right? The ship was seaworthy, barely, but it made it across. So it's not the falsity that explains why it was wrong, because whether it's true or false, we still have the same judgment morally about the ship owner. Just because you got lucky, as Clifford puts it, only means you weren't found out. Doesn't mean you didn't do something wrong. And then thirdly, it's not even the actual bad consequences, like the fact that that belief actually led in case 1 to death. Why? Well, because we have case 2. And Clifford thinks that your judgment morally of the man in case 2 will be no different from your judgment of him morally in case 1. Now, that's a potential place you might push back a little bit and say, no, I judge him much more harshly in the first case. And my judgment of him is still, I still think he did something immoral in case 2, but I think he's significantly less culpable, or I think he deserves significantly less blame in the second case because no one actually got hurt. Still, though, Clifford, I think, is going to insist that, but do you think what he did was wrong at all? As long as you say yes, however wrong you happen to think it was, the second case needs explanation too. And so the actual bad consequences only could explain the first case, but not the second. So what we need is some factor that's common to both cases, in addition to the social significance of the belief, that explains why we judge that it's immoral. Clifford says, here's what these two cases have in common. This is a belief that could impact the welfare of others and that was based upon insufficient evidence. And that is what explains why the ship owner's belief was wrong. Now, what we have is we've identified a socially significant belief that we judge to be immoral, and we think, if Clifford has convinced us, that the best explanation of that judgment is the insufficient evidence upon which the belief was based. And that's just one specific case. And remember, the premise that is being defended here is that it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything socially significant upon insufficient evidence. Clifford's thought, though, is that if he can get you to agree that having insufficient evidence in a case where a single belief is socially significant just thereby makes that belief morally wrong, then what follows is that in general, anyone at all who is situated in a relevant manner, relevantly like the ship owner, in other words, anyone at all who similarly neglected their evidence and formed a belief that was socially significant, would also thereby be believing in a manner that was morally wrong, right? So if you make this judgment in the particular case, Clifford thinks the reasons that led you to make the judgment in the particular case will generalize out to every case whatsoever. So that's the first premise, that every belief that is socially significant, it's always wrong to believe anything that is socially significant upon insufficient evidence. The second step is that every belief is socially significant. Now, why does Clifford think this? Here's how he puts it in the piece. No belief, however trifling and fragmentary it may seem, is ever truly insignificant. Why? It prepares us to receive more of its like, confirms those which resembled it before, and weakens others. And so gradually, it lays a stealthy train in our inmost thoughts, which may someday explode into overt action and leave its stamp upon our character forever. So a little bit dramatic there from Clifford. Here, I think, is his idea. I'm going to draw on this idea of a belief-forming habit. This is a little bit of terminology from contemporary epistemology. Clifford does not use this terminology, but I think this fairly represents what he's getting at in that passage and others in the piece. Let's say that a belief-forming habit is a disposition to form certain kinds of beliefs on certain kinds of bases or bases. Now, we don't just form beliefs, we also form them on certain bases. What does that mean? Well, why do you believe that you had cereal for breakfast? Well, you consult your memory. In general, your beliefs that you have about things you did in the immediate past, or even sometimes in the distant past, you have the habit of forming beliefs like that on the basis of your memory. Well, what about your beliefs about what's right in front of you right now? Well, if you believe, well, there's a desk in front of me, on what basis? Well, I have this visual experience, right, of this object that is shaped in a way that my concept of a desk tells me this is the way desks are shaped, and that's playing the function of a desk, and, that's why I believe there's a desk in front of me. That simple. I've got, my vision tells me. Why do you believe, say, some abstract fact that you learned in history class, or not abstract, some abstruse fact that you learned in history class, some esoteric detail about the Civil War or something? Well, you trust the makers of your textbook and or your history professor, right? It's their kind of testimony about this. Now, they have their own sources of evidence, hopefully, but in your case, you're relying on them and their say-so and their expertise. All of these are belief-forming habits. We can distinguish between individual belief-forming habits, like the ones that I just mentioned, tending to form beliefs about history based on the testimony of your history professor, tending to form beliefs about what you had for breakfast this morning on the basis of your own memory, and so on. Those are your individual belief-forming habits. But we can also, I think about what we could call collective belief-forming habits, which are the habits not just of you or of me or of your roommate or indeed of any individual person, but instead the belief-forming habits of the community taken as a whole, whether it's UCF or the state of Florida or the United States or humankind for that matter. We talked a little bit in class about how public opinion polling, especially in politics in the United States, part of what that's trying to do sometimes is use empirical methods and statistical data to uncover what the habits of a large group of people are with respect to their beliefs. So if you check out the Pew Research Center, this headline says that about 4 in 10 Americans say that social media is an important way of following COVID-19 vaccine news. This is from a little over a year ago. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that nearly half of the country has a particular kind of belief-forming habit, if this study is reflective of the reality. That habit is, I want to know what I should think and what I should believe about the vaccine. Well, the source I go to is social media, right? That's a belief forming habit, for better or for worse. What does this all have to do with the claim that every belief is socially significant? Here's, I think, what Clifford is getting at. The way that you go about forming your individual habits of belief, which are these dispositions to trust or not trust certain sources, the way you do that is by just forming an individual belief, just once, and then doing something similar again tomorrow, and then doing something similar the next day. Anytime you form a belief on any basis, in just a one-off manner, you are in a tiny way reinforcing or weakening a habit of belief, a belief-forming habit of you personally. Anytime you believe something, for example, without sufficient evidence, even once, in a small way, you're making it easier for yourself to, next time, believe something without sufficient evidence again. So you're making a habit out of it in a small way. And I think Clifford's thought is, not only are you, anytime you form any belief, influencing your own belief-forming habits, but you also thereby are, very indirectly and in a very tiny way, influencing the collective belief-forming habits of the community that you're in. And the collective belief-forming habits relate directly to the well-being of people other than you, right? So Clifford's thought is there's this kind of transmission that can happen. You go out and you form, like the ship owner, a belief on the basis of insufficient evidence once. Even if you get lucky and nothing bad happens, you've made it easier for yourself to form beliefs on the basis of insufficient evidence next time. And moreover, people who trust you, people who look to you, and I don't know, maybe you have children, maybe the ship owner has a child or a friend who trusts you. It's going to rub off a little bit on how they form their beliefs. We're social beings in our behaviors as well as in our beliefs. We look to one another to find out, what sources do you trust on this stuff, right? So that's the kind of mechanism of transmission, I think, that Clifford sees and is very insightful, I believe, about how it is that our beliefs, even in isolated cases, however insignificant it seems, very indirectly can influence the collective belief-forming habits of the whole communities we're in.